Picture this. You're sitting in your school cafeteria, surrounded by the usual lunchtime chaos. Students laughing, chatting, trading snacks. Suddenly, the noise dies down. Everyone turns to look at one table where something terrible is happening. A group of students has just poured orange juice all over a girl in a wheelchair, soaking her clothes, her books, her dignity. They're laughing. Others are pulling out their phones. Some look away, uncomfortable but unwilling to act. But then something extraordinary happens. A black girl from across the cafeteria stands up, not to record, not to laugh, but to act. This story, inspired by the countless real incidents happening in schools across America every single day, isn't just about bullying. It's about the intersection of ableism and racism, about how discrimination multiplies when you belong to more than one marginalized group, and about the extraordinary power of allyship when someone decides that silence is not an option. Today, we're diving deep into a story that represents the experiences of thousands of students with disabilities who face bullying at rates 2 to 3 times higher than their non-disabled peers. We'll explore how race and disability intersect to create unique challenges, and we'll celebrate the heroes among us, the students who choose courage over comfort, action over apathy. This isn't just a story about what happened in one cafeteria. It's a story about what happens every day in schools across our nation. And more importantly, it's about what we can all do to change it. Emily Martinez was 15 when our story takes place, a sophomore at Lincoln High School in what could be any American city. Born with spina bifida, she had been using a wheelchair since childhood, navigating a world not always designed with her in mind. But Emily was no stranger to challenges. She was an honor roll student, a member of the debate team, and someone who lit up any room she entered with her infectious laugh and quick wit. Emily's parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, had fought tirelessly to ensure their daughter had access to the same opportunities as her peers. They advocated for accessible classrooms, pushed for inclusive sports programs, and taught Emily to be her own advocate. We knew the world wouldn't always be kind, Maria would later reflect, but we wanted Emily to know she belonged everywhere she went. Emily's experience, unfortunately, is far from unique. According to research compiled by the National Bullying Prevention Center, children with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied than their non-disabled peers. In fact, studies reveal that 36% of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND, experience frequent bullying compared to 25% of those without SEND. The forms of harassment are varied and cruel: verbal abuse and name-calling, graphic or written statements, threats, physical assault, and other conduct that is physically threatening, harmful, or humiliating. For students like Emily, the school environment, which should be a place of learning and growth, often becomes a minefield of potential humiliation and harm. But our story isn't just about disability discrimination. It's about the complex intersection of multiple forms of oppression. As scholars at Disability Philanthropy note, racism and ableism are often thought of as parallel systems of oppression that work separately to perpetuate social hierarchy. Not only does this way of looking at the world ignore the experiences of people of color with disabilities, but it also fails to examine how race is pathologized in order to create racism. The reality is that people of color with disabilities face compounded discrimination and exclusion due to their disability and race, religion, and more. They encounter significant barriers in healthcare, education, employment, and access to public spaces. Black people with disabilities are also disproportionately incarcerated, experience higher rates of poverty than other racial groups, and are at higher risk of violence and abuse. Lincoln High School, like many American schools, was a microcosm of these broader social dynamics. With a student body that was 45% white, 30% Latino, 15% Black, and 10% other ethnicities, the school prided itself on diversity. But diversity in numbers doesn't automatically translate to inclusion in practice. The school had made efforts to be inclusive, Ramps were installed, accessible bathrooms were available, and there was even an official anti-bullying policy posted prominently in the main hallway. But policies on paper don't always translate to protection in practice, especially when those policies aren't actively enforced or when the broader school culture doesn't truly embrace the values they claim to uphold. In this environment, students, like Emily, often found themselves navigating not just physical barriers, but social ones as well. The intersection of her identity as a Latina student with a disability made her a target for multiple forms of discrimination. Some students made cruel jokes about her wheelchair. Others mimicked her movements. Still others simply ignored her existence altogether, treating her as if she were invisible. It was into this complex social ecosystem that our story unfolds, a story that would force the entire school community to confront uncomfortable truths about inclusion, allyship, and what it really means to stand up for others when it matters most. Tuesday, October 15th, a day that changed everything. The morning started like any other for Emily Martinez. She wheeled into Lincoln High School through the accessible entrance, greeting friends in the hallway, preparing for another day of classes. She had no way of knowing that by lunchtime, her life would become the center of a conversation about dignity, cruelty, and courage that would spread far beyond the walls of her school. The trouble began in third-period chemistry class. Emily had been paired with Jake Morrison for a lab experiment, a pairing that made her uncomfortable from the start. Jake was part of a group of students who had made Emily's life difficult since freshman year. They never said anything overtly cruel in front of teachers, but they had perfected the art of subtle harassment, accidentally blocking wheelchair-accessible paths, making jokes just loud enough for Emily to hear, referring to her as Wheels, when adults weren't around. "Great, I'm stuck with the cripple," Jake muttered under his breath as their teacher announced the partnerships. His friend Tyler snickered from the next table over. Emily felt her cheeks burn, but she said nothing. She had learned that responding often made things worse. Instead, she focused on the experiment, hoping to get through the class without further incident. But Jake wasn't finished. Throughout the 45-minute period, he made a show of having to work around Emily's wheelchair, sighing dramatically whenever he had to reach past her for equipment. When Emily dropped a pencil and couldn't immediately retrieve it, Jake kicked it further away. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. The final straw came when Jake accidentally spilled water near Emily's wheelchair, forcing her to wheel backward to avoid getting her books wet. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I didn't see you there." By lunchtime, Emily's nerves were already frayed. She wheeled into the cafeteria, hoping to find solace with her usual group of friends. But as fate would have it, Jake and his crew, Tyler, Madison, and Alex, were sitting at a table directly in Emily's path to her usual spot. Emily tried to wheel around them, taking the longer route to avoid confrontation. But Jake noticed her. "Detour. Hey guys, look, it's Wheels," Jake called out, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Trying to avoid us?" Emily kept moving, but Jake wasn't done. He stood up and walked over to her, his friends following. "What's the rush, Emily? Don't you want to hang out with us?" "Please just leave me alone," Emily said quietly, her voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. "Leave you alone?" Jake repeated, his voice dripping with fake concern. "But we just want to help. You look thirsty." And that's when it happened. Jake picked up his orange juice carton and with deliberate malice squeezed it, sending a stream of sticky orange liquid all over Emily's lap, her books, her backpack, and her wheelchair. His friends erupted in laughter, and several students nearby pulled out their phones to record the humiliation. Emily sat frozen, orange juice dripping from her hair, soaking through her clothes. The cafeteria had gone quiet except for the continued laughter from Jake's group and the sound of phone cameras clicking. She felt tears welling up in her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone. "Oops," Jake said, using the same mock-innocent tone from chemistry class. "My bad. I guess your wheels need a wash anyway." Emily wheeled toward the bathroom as quickly as she could, desperate to clean herself up and escape the staring eyes of her classmates. She felt utterly alone, humiliated, and defeated. In the bathroom, she tried to clean the orange juice from her clothes and wheelchair with paper towels, but the sticky residue seemed impossible to remove completely. She thought about calling her parents, about asking to go home sick. She thought about transferring schools, about homeschooling, about anything that would help her escape this crushing embarrassment. She had experienced bullying before, but never something this public, this deliberately cruel. But 20 minutes later, as Emily reluctantly prepared to return to the cafeteria to retrieve her lunch bag, she heard something that stopped her cold. Jake Morrison was screaming. Zara Washington had been sitting 3 tables away when the incident occurred. Junior, Zara was known for her quiet confidence, her academic excellence, and her involvement in the school's social justice club. She was also one of only 43 black students in a school of nearly 800. Zara had watched the entire scene unfold with growing anger. She had seen Jake's deliberate cruelty, heard his mocking laughter, witnessed Emily's humiliation. And she had also seen something that many others missed: the way other students looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to act. For Zara, this moment crystallized everything she had been learning about intersectional oppression and allyship. She understood, in a way that many of her peers did not, what it meant to be marginalized, to be targeted, to feel invisible and vulnerable. She also understood that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. So 20 minutes after Emily had fled to the bathroom, Zara acted. She had spent those 20 minutes methodically planning. First, she approached Jake's table with her phone out, recording. "Hey, Jake," she said loudly, making sure her voice carried across the cafeteria. "Did you know that what you just did to Emily is considered disability-based harassment? It's actually a federal crime under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Jake looked up, annoyed. "Mind your own business, Zara. It became my business when you decided to humiliate someone in public," Zara replied, her voice steady and clear. "It became everyone's business. And just so you know, I've already sent the video I took to the principal, the superintendent, and the state's civil rights office." The color drained from Jake's face. "You can't do that. You didn't have permission to record me." "Actually, in a public space like a school cafeteria, I can," Zara said. "But here's what's going to happen next. You're going to go find Emily. You're going to apologize publicly, and you're going to make this right. Because if you don't, that video goes to the local news, to social media, and to every college you're hoping to attend." Jake stood up aggressively. "Who do you think you are?" And that's when Zara played her masterstroke. "I'm someone who understands that when we see injustice, we have a choice. We can be bystanders, or we can be allies. I'm choosing to be an ally." What happened next would be talked about at Lincoln High School for years to come. Other students, emboldened by Zara's courage, began to speak up. Maria Santos, a senior who had been friends with Emily since middle school, stood up and joined Zara. Then David Kim, a quiet sophomore who had his own experiences with bullying. Then others. Within minutes, Jake Morrison found himself surrounded not by allies, but by a group of students who had decided that Emily's dignity mattered more than their own comfort. The tables had turned, and for the first time, Jake was the one who looked small and afraid. The video Zara had recorded spread through the school's student body within hours, and by the end of the day, it had reached the administration. Principal Jennifer Morrison, no relation to Jake, was forced to confront a situation that exposed deep flaws in her school's approach to inclusion and anti-bullying measures. The initial response was disappointing but predictable. Despite the clear evidence of disability-based harassment, the school's first instinct was damage control rather than justice. Jake Morrison received a 3-day suspension, a slap on the wrist that felt more like a vacation than a consequence. Emily was called to the principal's office and offered counseling services, as if the problem was her emotional response rather than the systematic harassment she had endured. The school's reaction showed exactly why these incidents keep happening, says Dr. Patricia Williams, a disability rights advocate who later became involved in the case. When institutions treat harassment as a conflict between students, rather than a violation of civil rights, they perpetuate the very systems that allow bullying to flourish. The days following the incident were among the darkest in Emily's young life. Despite the support she had received from Zara and other students, the humiliation felt overwhelming. She missed 3 days of school, claiming illness, but really struggling with anxiety and depression that her parents recognized as trauma responses. I kept replaying it in my mind, Emily would later share in a speech to the school board. Not just what Jake did, but the fact that it happened in front of hundreds of people. I felt like I could never show my face at school again. Emily's parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, were outraged by both the incident and the school's inadequate response. As advocates for their daughter since birth, they knew that this moment would either break Emily's spirit or galvanize her into action. They chose to help her find her voice. Working with disability rights organizations, the Martinez family learned that Emily's experience was protected under multiple federal laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. They discovered that schools have a legal obligation to provide a discrimination-free environment for students with disabilities. We realized that this wasn't just about Emily, Carlos Martinez explained in a later interview. This was about every student with a disability who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong in their own school. While Emily grappled with trauma, Zara faced her own challenges as the student who had dared to disrupt the status quo. The backlash was swift and predictable. Some students accused her of making everything about race or being a social justice warrior. Others questioned why she had gotten involved in something that wasn't her business. More troubling were the subtle forms of retaliation. Teachers who had previously praised Zara's class participation began overlooking her raised hand. Her guidance counselor suggested she might want to tone down her activism if she wanted strong college recommendation letters. The message was clear. Students who challenge injustice do so at their own risk. I started to understand why so many people choose to look away, Zara reflected months later. Standing up for others comes with a cost, especially when you're already marginalized yourself. As a black girl in a predominantly white school, I was already walking a tightrope. Speaking up about disability discrimination made that tightrope even thinner. But Zara also discovered something powerful. She wasn't alone. Her actions had inspired other students to share their own experiences with discrimination and bullying. A sophomore named Marcus revealed that he had been targets of racial slurs. Sarah, a senior with ADHD, talked about how teachers had publicly humiliated her for her learning differences. David shared his experiences as an openly gay student facing homophobic harassment. As more students came forward, a pattern emerged that went far beyond individual incidents of bullying. Lincoln High School, like many American schools, had created an environment where discrimination thrived through a combination of inadequate policies, insufficient training, and a culture that prioritized reputation over real inclusion. Research supports what the Lincoln High School students were experiencing. Studies show that intersectional discrimination, harassment based on multiple identities, is often more severe and less likely to be properly addressed by institutions. Students of color with disabilities face what researchers call double jeopardy, experiencing both racism and ableism in ways that compound their marginalization. Rather than allowing the administration to treat each incident as isolated, Zara and Emily began working together to document the systemic nature of discrimination at their school. They created a survey, distributed through social media and student networks, asking about experiences with bias-based harassment. The results were staggering. Of the 247 students who responded, 73% had witnessed bias-based harassment at school. 45% had personally experienced harassment based on race, disability, sexual orientation, or other identities. Only 12% felt confident that reporting harassment would lead to meaningful consequences. 67% said they had never received adequate education about what constitutes harassment or how to respond as a bystander. The survey revealed that what happened to Emily wasn't an anomaly, Zara explained to the local newspaper. It was part of a pattern of discrimination that the school had been ignoring for years. Armed with data and supported by civil rights organizations, Emily's family filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. The complaint alleged that Lincoln High School had violated Emily's rights under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act by failing to prevent and adequately respond to disability-based harassment. The legal action sent shockwaves through the school district. Suddenly, what administrators had hoped to handle quietly as a student conflict was exposed as a federal civil rights violation with potentially serious consequences for the entire district. As disability rights advocates note, schools have a legal obligation to investigate and remedy disability-based harassment. When they fail to do so, they're not just failing individual students, they're violating federal law. 3 months after the initial incident, Lincoln High School found itself at the center of a civil rights investigation that would fundamentally change how the district approached inclusion and anti-bullying efforts. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights had launched a formal investigation, and the story had gained national attention through social media and advocacy networks. But the real turning point came not from external pressure, but from within the school community itself. Emily Martinez and Zara Washington had transformed from isolated individuals into the leaders of a movement that would redefine what student advocacy could accomplish. On a cold February morning, Principal Morrison announced that there would be a mandatory student assembly to address recent concerns about school climate. What she didn't anticipate was that Emily and Zara had spent weeks preparing for this moment. With support from disability rights organizations and civil rights groups, they had developed a presentation that would force the entire school community to confront the reality of discrimination in their halls. Emily had found her voice and she was ready to use it. 3 months ago, I was humiliated in our cafeteria, Emily began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. But today, I'm not here as a victim. I'm here as an advocate for every student who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong in their own school. The auditorium was silent as Emily shared statistics about disability-based harassment, read excerpts from the survey responses, and challenged her classmates to examine their own roles in perpetuating discrimination. But it was when Zara joined her on stage that the presentation became truly powerful. When I stood up for Emily that day in the cafeteria, some people asked me why I got involved, Zara said. They said it wasn't my business. But here's what I learned. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. When we allow discrimination against any member of our community, we're all diminished. What happened next surprised everyone, including Emily and Zara themselves. Students began standing up, literally rising from their seats to share their own experiences with discrimination and bias. Marcus talked about racial harassment he had faced. Sarah discussed how her learning disability had been used against her by both students and teachers. David shared his experiences with homophobic bullying, but more importantly, students who had never been targets of harassment began to speak up about what they had witnessed and their failure to act. Jessica, a popular senior, admitted that she had laughed at disability-based jokes because she thought it made her fit in. Tommy, a football player, acknowledged that he had used racial slurs without thinking about their impact. The assembly became this incredible moment of truth-telling, recalled Dr. Williams, who was present as an advocate. Students were naming systems of oppression that adults had spent years pretending didn't exist. The student presentations forced Principal Morrison to acknowledge publicly what the civil rights investigation had already revealed. Lincoln High School had failed its most vulnerable students. But rather than becoming defensive, she made a choice that would define her legacy. As an educational leader, I need to apologize, Morrison said, taking the microphone after the student presentations, not just for this incident, but for creating a culture where students felt they couldn't report harassment, where discrimination was ignored, and where the burden of change was placed on victims rather than on the institution that was supposed to protect them. Morrison announced immediate changes: mandatory bias training for all staff, a complete overhaul of the school's anti-bullying policies, the creation of a student civil rights team, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system with guaranteed follow-up. More importantly, she committed to regular audits of school climate and transparent reporting to the community. Perhaps the most unexpected moment came when Jake Morrison, the student whose actions had started this chain of events, requested to speak. The auditorium fell silent as he walked to the microphone, his usual swagger replaced by visible remorse. "I want to apologize to Emily," he said, his voice shaking. "Not because I got in trouble, but because I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I want to apologize to everyone in this room, because my actions reflected poorly on all of us." Jake's apology was met with mixed reactions. Some students appreciated his acknowledgement of wrongdoing, while others questioned whether his remorse was genuine or simply self-preservation. But Emily's response surprised everyone. "I accept your apology," she said, "but apologies are only meaningful if they lead to changed behavior. I hope you'll use this experience to become someone who stands up for others instead of tearing them down." The assembly was recorded with permission and shared through advocacy networks, becoming a model for how schools can address systemic discrimination. Other districts began reaching out to Lincoln High School for guidance on implementing similar programs. More importantly, the students themselves became advocates beyond their own school walls. Emily and Zara were invited to speak at conferences, to meet with legislators, and to share their story with other young people facing similar challenges. When Emily Martinez rolled into Lincoln High School as a senior, she entered a fundamentally different institution than the one where she had been humiliated 18 months earlier. The changes were visible everywhere: new accessibility features, diverse artwork celebrating different abilities and identities, and a student body that had been educated about inclusion and allyship. But the most significant changes were less visible. The school climate survey that had revealed widespread discrimination now showed dramatic improvements. Harassment incidents had decreased by 78%, reporting rates had increased by 156%, and student satisfaction with the school's response to bias incidents had improved from 12% to 89%. "It's not that discrimination disappeared overnight," Emily explained in an interview with the local newspaper. "But we created a culture where discrimination is no longer tolerated, where bystanders are expected to become allies, and where students know their voices matter." The girl who had once considered transferring schools to escape humiliation had become one of the state's most prominent young disability rights advocates. Emily testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger anti-bullying protections for students with disabilities. She spoke at the annual conference of the power of peer advocacy. She even co-authored an article with Zara for a national education journal about intersectional approaches to school climate improvement. Emily's transformation shows what happens when we support young people instead of silencing them, said Dr. Williams. She went from being a target of discrimination to being a leader in the fight against it. Emily's advocacy extended beyond her own school. She worked with Pacer's National Bullying Prevention Center to develop resources specifically designed by and for students with disabilities. Her story became part of training materials used by schools across the country. Zara Washington's act of allyship that day in the cafeteria had set her on a path toward becoming a bridge builder between different advocacy communities. She spent her senior year developing partnerships between the school's various affinity groups, the Black Student Union, the Disability Awareness Club, the LGBTQ+ Alliance, and others. "I learned that our struggles are interconnected," Zara reflected. "When we fight discrimination against one group, we're fighting discrimination against all groups. True allyship means understanding how different forms of oppression intersect and supporting each other across those intersections." Zara was accepted to college with a full scholarship, where she planned to study social justice and public policy. But she credits her experience standing up for Emily as the moment that shaped her understanding of her own power and responsibility. the Office for Civil Rights Investigation concluded with Lincoln High School entering into a voluntary resolution agreement that required ongoing monitoring and reporting, but the changes went far beyond legal compliance. The district implemented mandatory training for all staff on disability rights, implicit bias, and inclusive classroom management, a peer advocacy program modeled after regular climate surveys, with transparent reporting to the community, a student civil rights team with real authority to investigate and recommend consequences for bias incidents, curriculum changes to include disability history and intersectional approaches to civil rights. Other school districts began adopting similar programs, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond Lincoln High School's walls. Perhaps most surprisingly, Jake Morrison became one of the program's most effective advocates. His genuine remorse and commitment to change led him to join the student civil rights team, where he used his experience as a former perpetrator to help other students understand the impact of their actions. Jake's transformation shows that people can change, Emily said, but it also shows that accountability and education are more effective than punishment alone. Emily and Zara's story contributed to a growing national conversation about the need for intersectional approaches to anti-bullying efforts. Their work was cited in congressional hearings about disability rights in education and influenced federal guidance on addressing bias-based harassment in schools. Most importantly, their story inspired countless other students to find their own voices and stand up for their own communities. Social media campaigns using Allies Not Bystanders spread across the country, with students sharing their own experiences and commitments to creating more inclusive schools. The story of Emily Martinez and Zara Washington reminds us that some of the most powerful moments in the fight for justice happen not in courtrooms or legislative chambers, but in school cafeterias and hallways where young people decide that enough is enough. Their experience teaches us several crucial lessons. First, that discrimination thrives in silence. When we treat harassment as kids being kids or normal teenage behavior, we give permission for cruelty to continue. Emily's humiliation was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a culture that had normalized disability-based harassment. Second, that allyship requires action, not just sympathy. Zara's decision to stand up for Emily wasn't just emotionally supportive, it was strategically effective. She understood that meaningful allyship requires risk, preparation, and sustained commitment to change. Third, that individual courage can catalyze systemic change. What began as one student's refusal to accept injustice became a school-wide transformation that influenced policies and practices far beyond Lincoln High School. Finally, that young people have the power to create the world they want to inherit. Emily and Zara didn't wait for adults to solve the problems they were experiencing. They organized, advocated, and demanded better from their institutions and their communities. This story continues every day in schools across our nation. Right now, there are students like Emily facing harassment because of their disabilities. There are potential allies like Zara deciding whether to act or look away. There are institutions choosing between accountability and avoidance. The question is, what role will you play? Will you be a bystander who records cruelty for entertainment? Will you be an institution that prioritizes reputation over justice? Or will you be an ally who understands that true inclusion requires constant vigilance, sustained effort, and the courage to act when it matters most? The choice and the power to create change is in your hands.